Next on Link TV, Latin Pulse, news and analysis from Latin America as seen by Latin American media, followed by a panel discussion on the issues. Next on Latin Pulse, only on Link TV.
The following program is an original production of Link TV.
Free trade continues to be a controversial issue for Latin America. Some say the region is becoming increasingly dependent on the U.S. for trade and security. But despite stiff opposition, both here and abroad, these agreements continue to be ratified, and not always with the U.S.
En 3 años, Honduras y El Salvador vamos a exportar 60,000 toneladas de azúcar a Taiwán, lo que es el doble de la cuota que tenemos en el Tratado de Libre Comercio con Estados Unidos.
Plus, U.S. policy is the target of strong criticism as Latin American presidents meet to discuss common strategies and markets. Is the region moving away from U.S. influence, and should we be concerned? This and more coming up next on Latin Pulse. Hello and welcome to Pulso Latino. I'm your host, Ena Cuevas. Our topic tonight, U.S.-Latin America relations and what we can expect from the new administration coming into the White House next year.
Aseguró que si no son aprobados los tratados de libre comercio, el Congreso de su país asestaría un fuerte golpe a la región. Específicamente, sobre el tratado con Colombia, dijo:
A country that not 7 years ago, just 7 years ago, was on the verge of becoming a failed state.
The United States is getting ready to elect a new leader. And in Latin America, there is growing frustration and dissatisfaction with the relationship between the U.S. and the region. Countries such as Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are all pushing for less reliance on the U.S. The question of security and being under the umbrella of the U.S. doesn't seem to be as important today as it was during the Cold War. And the fact that the region is sitting on a wealth of oil and other natural resources makes U.S. economic aid seem less relevant.
Al imperio norteamericano le hablo, porque él es el amo. Sigan y ustedes verán que no les enviaremos una gota de petróleo al imperio de los Estados Unidos.
First, we'll explore the topic of economic aid and the U.S. security umbrella, starting with the multi-nation union being promoted by Venezuela's president, Hugo Chávez.
Deberíamos trabajar en el ALBA para conformar una estrategia de defensa conjunta e ir articulando nuestras fuerzas armadas, porque el enemigo es el mismo, el imperio de los Estados Unidos, dijo Chávez durante la transmisión de su programa Aló Presidente. Asimismo, el gobernante venezolano insistió en la unión de los miembros del ALBA, Alternativa Bolivariana para las Américas, frente al gobierno estadounidense. El que se meta con uno de nosotros tendrá que meterse con todos, porque responderemos como uno solo, dijo.
Bolivia's President Evo Morales is also taking a harder stance against the U.S. He now wants to change the country's constitution so that it prohibits U.S. military presence in Bolivia.
Durante su homenaje al Che Guevara, Evo Morales anunció que la nueva constitución de Bolivia va a prohibir la instalación de bases militares estadounidenses. Asimismo, el gobernante recalcó que la apuesta de su gobierno a través de la Asamblea Constituyente es no permitir bases militares de ningún tipo en el territorio boliviano. Quisiera que todos los latinoamericanos, a la cabeza de los movimientos sociales, campesinos, obreros y clase media, apostemos desde Latinoamérica a que el gobierno de Estados Unidos no piense más en bases militares en la región, dijo Morales.
But at the same time, countries aligned with the Bush administration are welcoming stronger ties. Such is the case of El Salvador. The country recently signed a cooperation agreement with U.S. law enforcement agencies to help fight gang violence in Central America. The focus is on gangs, but the agency is already being compared with the School of the Americas, a former police training facility in the state of Georgia. The school closed after claims that it was a training facility for Latin American repressive regimes. One country that suffered under such governments for more than half a century is Guatemala. Recently, though, Guatemala elected a new president who has vowed to make social justice his top priority.
Le doy gracias a Dios porque le toca a Guatemala, por primera vez en 50 años, un cambio hacia un gobierno socialdemócrata, hacia un gobierno con enfoque social, precedido por un gobierno que con madurez, que con profesionalismo supo hacer una transición y permitir que ese cambio se inicie hoy mismo en una forma ordenada, en una forma civilizada.
The Cumbre Iberoamericana Summit was held this winter in Santiago, Chile. It was attended by all of the region's presidents, and its main focus was social justice. But U.S. policy in the region was also a hot topic, as we hear from Uruguay's president, Tabaré Vázquez.
Coincido también con las palabras del señor vicepresidente de la hermana República de Cuba en cuanto a que los bloqueos realmente son absolutamente ilegales y un golpe muy fuerte para cualquier comunidad.
In our studios to talk about the issue of U.S.-Latin American relations, we have Ted Lewis, Director Human Rights at Global Exchange. And from Washington, D.C., we are joined by Manuel Pérez Rocha, Associate Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. First of all, welcome both of you for being here today at Pulso Latino.
Thank you.
Let's start talking about trade. According to the Heritage Foundation, trade between the U.S. and Latin America accounts for about 20% of the U.S. world trade. So why has it been so difficult for the U.S. to approve a lot of these agreements throughout Latin America?
Well, there's a lot of resistance to the U.S. trade arrangements because they're not good for the majority of the population of these countries. There's something called the Washington Consensus that is getting a lot of pushback from all over Latin America at this point because the record on these kind of trade agreements is very bad. If you take a look at Mexico, you'll see that the economy of Mexico, while being integrated into the North American economy, has deindustrialized and the agricultural sector has gone down. What has this done? It has sent, despite investment that's come into the country, it has sent millions of people across the U.S. border into the immigration stream against their will. So countries in South America, when they look at the track record on these trade agreements and they look back historically at how the United States has tried to dominate Latin America both militarily and via military dictatorships in recent years, they say, no, let's try and make an arrangement internally and something that'll work for us. Let's not repeat the experience that Mexico and other countries to the north have already had.
And Mr. Rocha, a lot of the countries in Latin America, what they're doing is they are signing agreements with different countries, such as Taiwan. How concerned should the U.S. be about these different trade agreements with other countries other than America?
As my colleague Ted says, NAFTA has served as an example of how the promises made to negotiate and conclude free trade agreements haven't been fulfilled. And Mexico, when NAFTA started being negotiated, they promised very concretely more jobs, better wages, and better products for the people, and better prices. And the effects have been completely the contrary. So the United States now is being, as well as Europe, as the European Union, are negotiating bilateral free trade agreements and breaking from their promise also to try to negotiate this kind of multilateral trading system.
It seems like both of you agree that these free trade agreements have not been beneficial to Latin America, and that's why there's a rejection. But some would argue that there's an inherent problem with the way that the Latin American economies are set up, precisely to protect the companies and the families who control the economy, and that's why the agreement doesn't work.
Well, it's actually the elites in Latin America that have benefited from trade agreements where they've been established. So while that sounds like a nice argument, it really isn't the case. The top sectors of society, and of course, even amongst the elites, there's winners and losers in these matters. But the point is that the vast majority of all these societies have seen their economic position erode. They've seen the distribution of income within their societies get worse, with much more at the top end and the bottom left off. And these are the kinds of social pressures that create opposition movements. That's why Hugo Chavez is so popular. That's why he gets elected over and over again, because he's actually spoken to these issues and is trying to articulate a different vision for the hemisphere. Whether or not we agree with him, we have to recognize that the vision that he's putting forward is very attractive to people who've been crushed under these kind of economic arrangements, whether they be the modern version of the free trade agreement of the Americas or area of the Americas, or the older version of gunboat diplomacy, people in Latin America know that if they get too close to the Washington politics, they're going to get ripped off. And it's as simple as that.
Mr. Rocha, do you think that this is just a product of the Bush administration and that there might be a change with the new administration that's coming in next year?
Well, it's not a product of Bush administration. As we may recall, the NAFTA was negotiated by President Bill Clinton, President Salinas de Gortari, and the Canadian Prime Minister then. This was not Bush's administration, definitely. I think there's like a bipartisan agreement here in the United States to carry on with free trade agreements. So it is very important that in this electoral debate, there should be channels for organizations, institutes, think tanks to provide candidates with knowledge and data and figures and facts on how free trade agreements affect or do not affect the economy and the different segments of people in different countries.
So you don't believe that there would be a change either with the Democrats or the Republicans in the White House?
Well, the one candidate who did articulate real concerns about the free trade arrangements was John Edwards. He's been forced out of the race at this point. Between Clinton and Obama, Obama has not taken a strong position around these issues. Of course, Clinton, historically, the Clinton White House was very mixed up in pushing NAFTA, originally in the campaign saying that they didn't like NAFTA, but then once taking power, actually pushing the NAFTA agreement through Congress and overseeing that. So we don't see great potential for change, but it's very important that the advisors to these candidates recognize that there's a push, not just in Latin America, but also in the United States, to revise these things and to look at them. The outcry against NAFTA that's come out naturally and organically on the campaign trail this spring has been astounding to the candidates, and they're open to listening. Whether Hillary Clinton would actually do anything once she gets into the White House, we have a lot of doubt about.
Juan Gabriel Valdez, Chilean ambassador to the UN Security Council, was recently in the San Francisco Bay Area. He says relationships between the U.S. and Latin America are evolving into more multilateral partnerships.
Yo quisiera que el próximo gobierno de Estados Unidos, que va a ser elegido pronto, sea un gobierno que vuelva a poner el tema de los organismos multilaterales y del trabajo multilateral como una cuestión muy fundamental. Multilateral significa que uno invita a sus amigos para conversar con ellos lo que quiere hacer. Unilateral es, al contrario, el notificar a sus vecinos de lo que va a hacer y obligarlos a estar o a favor o en contra. Esa política no ha tenido resultados. Ha sido mala para Estados Unidos y ha sido mala para la relación con América Latina. Yo creo que hoy día hay claras señales de que se puede reconstruir una relación muy positiva entre Estados Unidos y la región del sur.
Trade has always been a hot issue for both the U.S. and Latin America. That's because everybody seems to recognize that there is value in a healthy trade partnership between North and South. This became clear during a recent visit by Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to Colombia. She was there to promote a free trade agreement between both countries.
La funcionaria estadounidense llegó el jueves al aeropuerto Río Negro de Medellín, 570 kilómetros al noroeste de Bogotá, en medio de un fuerte dispositivo de seguridad y de protestas estudiantiles por su visita a la ciudad. Durante su estancia en Colombia, Rice y su comitiva, que incluye a un grupo de congresistas demócratas, mantendrán reuniones con funcionarios colombianos, líderes sindicales y representantes del sector privado. Durante su estadía, la funcionaria hablará con el presidente de Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, sobre narcotráfico y seguridad, así como el Tratado de Libre Comercio bilateral, hablamos del TLC, cuyo aval está pendiente en el Congreso estadounidense. El canciller colombiano, Fernando Araujo Perdomo, dijo que el gobierno de su país recibe con optimismo la llegada de Rice, pues esta es una clara señal del respaldo de Estados Unidos al TLC con Colombia, dijo.
Colombia's president traveled to Washington recently to support that free trade agreement. There he was confronted by Colombians who accused him of supporting death squads.
No FTA! No FTA!
No. Let them speak. Let them speak.
Colombia is not for sale. Colombia is not for sale. Colombia is not for sale.
El mandatario pidió que no sacaran a los manifestantes y respondió preguntas de quienes lo habían recibido con protestas a la entrada. Y Gerardo Cajamarca lo acusó de estar detrás de los grupos paramilitares.
¿Es que yo acaso los creé? Yo los encontré.
¿Seguro?
Pues pruébeme lo contrario.
Al Capone fue condenado por evasión de impuestos.
Qué tristeza tener que aceptar estos vejámenes. Alguien que lleva tanto tiempo fuera de Colombia, en aras del respeto a la democracia. No se vaya a hacer decir usted terrorista sin camuflado. Que los hombres también tenemos dignidad. Ahí van viendo ustedes el nivel del debate político con algunos de mis compatriotas.
Central America has also approved a free trade agreement with the U.S., joining other regional partners such as Canada, Mexico, and Chile. But reaching an agreement with the Central American community wasn't easy. There were massive protests against the agreement and strong opposition to opening these Latin American markets to U.S. products. In Costa Rica's case, it took more than a year for it to ratify the treaty. This was seen as a sign that not everybody supports an open market economy.
El presidente Oscar Arias dio un discurso conciliador tras el referendo que, según analistas, despertó más pasiones que muchas elecciones presidenciales. Arias había dicho que rechazar el acuerdo iba a ser un suicidio colectivo para los costarricenses porque aseguró el país perdería la oportunidad de atraer inversiones y generar empleos de calidad. Los opositores al Tratado de Libre Comercio, entre los que se cuentan sindicatos, académicos, activistas y productores agrícolas, creen que la apertura de las empresas estatales significará una pérdida de soberanía, mientras que los defensores del tratado ven una oportunidad para hacer más eficientes esos sectores.
But free trade agreements are not exclusive to the United States. More Latin American countries are looking elsewhere for new trading partners. Some argue Washington should be concerned as it continues to lose control over Latin American economies that were once highly dependent on trade with the U.S. That's the case of El Salvador and Honduras. They recently signed an agreement with Taiwan.
El Tratado de Libre Comercio con Taiwán es considerado por los gobiernos de Honduras y El Salvador como la puerta de entrada al mercado asiático, que permitirá solo en Taiwán llegar a 23 millones de habitantes.
En 3 años, Honduras y El Salvador vamos a exportar 60.000 toneladas de azúcar a Taiwán, lo que es el doble de la cuota que tenemos en el Tratado de Libre Comercio con Estados Unidos. Ahora invertir en El Salvador, invertir en Honduras, es invertir en México, es invertir en los Estados Unidos, es invertir en los países que tenemos inversiones con libre comercio.
Con el tratado, El Salvador no pagará impuestos en más del 67% de aranceles que Taiwán cobra en materia comercial.
Should this increase in trade between Latin America and countries other than the U.S. be of concern?
Well, it might be of concern to certain companies in the U.S., but it shouldn't be of concern to people in Latin America because diversifying the economies is a goal that any country should have. That means if there's there's an old saying in Mexico that if the United States sneezes, economically speaking, Mexico gets pneumonia. It's better for Mexico to have more trade relations and good ones rather than be dependent on one country, and the same goes in South America.
One example is the Mercosur, no? The Mercosur has been defined as a very definite stepping stone for the creation of a South American identity and a South American interest that is defined very clearly in contrast to the U.S. hegemony in the whole region. So there is an emergence now of a South American identity, and I'm not saying Latin America, because somehow Mexico and also the Central American countries are already integrated into the U.S. system of trade via the NAFTA and the Central American Free Trade Agreement. But in terms of South America, there is now a much stronger identity on how to have intra-trade, which is not dependent on a free trade agreement with the United States.
Switching topics, some say that the economic aid that goes to Latin America has strings attached, that somehow it's a way for the U.S. to use that as an excuse for some type of military presence or an exchange of something.
That has historically certainly been the case. I think one of the interesting things about U.S. aid to Latin America these days, as well as loans from multilateral institutions, is that it's beginning to be dwarfed, at least in South America, by the kind of aid programs that are generated internally. The petroleum wealth of Venezuela has allowed that government, and in combination with others, but principally there, to start to loan internally. So that takes the pressure away from these kind of programs. But the United States military aid programs and economic aid programs have been tied into a bundle that really have been, in many cases, very pernicious and have allowed a sort of fifth column to be inside a lot of Latin American countries. And that's why we saw that countries fell so easily to military coups, because the military officers had been trained in U.S. military schools, and when time came, their friends were in Washington, and they could count on them, and that's why we've seen this sort of things happening. So people are, I think, rightly skeptical of U.S. aid. That said, it's important that the kind of transitional funds that Manuel was talking about to support a healthy integration in North America happen. And these are not necessarily massive transfers. We're talking about what sounds like a lot of money, but $10 billion a year over a 10-year period could do a tremendous amount at the grassroots in Mexico to bring communities into balance, so that the kind of immigration pressures that hit communities when there's an agricultural crisis, sending out in aggregate millions of people, these kind of things could actually be reversed. And those are the kind of funds that would be welcome in Latin America, but it can't be part of a military or security plan. Otherwise, this is not an equal playing field.
Mr. Rocha, do you believe the U.S. is doing as much as it can to help Latin America when it comes to financial aid?
We cannot generalize here and say historically that every aid of the United States to Latin America has been bad or anything, but we have to see case by case, historically. And we have now a very important example which we're working on, which is the Plan Merida, by which the United States is funneling loads of money to Mexico, around $1 billion for 2 years of financial aid. And this financial aid is basically for armament against, to be used against the narco traffic, the struggle against the narco traffic. But there are very strong concerns about the issue of human rights involved here, because there are lots of groups in Mexico that are very worried about the escalation of repression. And there is somehow a thin line between the fight, for example, against narco traffic and sometimes repressive activities in Mexico. So there are worries, and there are lots of organizations working on trying to convince or make the United States see how their help could be better used for example, alleviating poverty in Mexico, attacking this very complex problem simply with more armament may not be the best use of U.S. aid.
I did want to mention in reference to what Manuel just said, that this Plan Mexico, or as they like to call it, Plan Merida, is basically a military aid package. By giving Felipe Calderon, who will also be meeting with President Bush and Canadian Prime Minister Harper in New Orleans around the 20th of April, by giving them this kind of military cooperation, he is backing President Calderon up in a way that is not like the relationships that we have anywhere else, the United States, that is in Latin America at this point. President Calderon did come in, questioned very strongly due to the nature of the Mexican elections. And many people, myself included, believe that there was fraudulent activity in that election that brought him to power. So the United States backing him up militarily at this point and pushing his image up via the war against narco traffic is a very dangerous road for us to go down, because we are as a country, this country, pushing a kind of illegitimate politics in Mexico that we thought had been left behind. At this point, President Calderon, because he's getting that kind of support, doesn't feel the need to negotiate with other people, other sectors of Mexican society. It's one of the hardest line presidencies that we've seen in decades, and this is a very dangerous kind of presidency to be backing up in this sort of way. So when President Calderon comes to the United States, we hope that as he travels around the United States, he's going to be questioned severely about the repressive tactics that were used in Oaxaca to put down a people's movement there, the kind of repressive tactics that were used in the lead up to the election that he never spoke out against. There are a number of issues on the table that Felipe Calderon, President Bush, and President Harper need to answer to.
Tough questions that they have to face. I trust you enjoyed today's program. I'd like to thank our guest here in San Francisco, Ted Lewis from Global Exchange, and in Washington, D.C., Manuel Perez Rocha from the Institute for Policy Studies. I also want to thank you at home or on the web for being with us today. We also want to thank American University in Washington, D.C. and the students at the School of Communication for helping with the research for this program. Join us next time when we take a closer look at Latin America through the eyes of Latin American media. For more information about Pulso Latino and Latin America, log on to linktv.org. I'm Ana Cuevas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time here on Latin Pulse.
Latin Pulse was made possible thanks to the generous contribution from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Pulso Latino ha sido posible gracias a la generosa contribución de la Fundación John D. y Catherine T. MacArthur.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs that connect you to the world.